Russian propaganda is at its heart nihilistic. Its effects can be highly corrosive, and it does not necessarily try to convince you of its point of view. Rather, it seeks to engender division, conflict, and in some circumstances, apathy and inaction. Today, I'm discussing a wide variety of themes with social philosopher and YouTube phenomenon, Vlad Vexler. Themes such as propaganda and imperialism, authoritarian media spaces, and their impact on how people think and act. Of course, we'll also be talking about the war and the changes in Russia that this may trigger. The Silicon Curtain podcast has been created to explore issues around propaganda narratives and techniques and the threat they pose to open societies. If you enjoy the material we create, then please like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Vlad Vexler is a philosopher working in ethics and musicology, but he is also the host of several wildly popular YouTube channels and that provide a guide to surviving and making sense of the 21st century. But recently, his focus has been on covering the crisis in Russia and Ukraine in detail. His content is created for reflective people who feel the present resources for making sense of our world are inadequate, but pulls off that extraordinary trick to be both informative and entertaining at the same time. So please do check out his excellent content on YouTube. Vlad, welcome to the channel.
It's lovely to be with you. Lovely to be with everybody.
Fantastic. Well, let's start with social research, because we hear so many figures coming out of what Russians think, how they act, but can you actually have any kind of real social research in an autocracy, especially where any kind of dissent can land you a 15-year jail term?
I think social scientists are in a slight quarrel about just how much the rejection rate has gone up, the rejection rate when you're asked to participate in a poll, because effectively you're being called at home, typically on a landline, and you are asked to take a step or two toward saying things that might constitute a criminal offense in Russia. So the vast majority of people don't want to do polls. But I think that with a lot of experience, we can still learn something from polls. But as ever, above and beyond polls, what we can say is that it's possible to have a feeling on the ground, right? I mean, we've all been in countries where we've stayed for more than just a couple of days that are very complex political environments. And you just know that there's something most people are not buying. You just know that there is something that most people really see through and so on. So I think we can make some generalizations. I mean, here are some of them. Russians know way more about what their government is really doing in Ukraine, in my view, than they're letting on. So that's quite interesting, because what it means is that this business of enlightening them is actually counterproductive on the whole. They have a pretty reasonable idea of what's going on. The problem is that they can't face it. So the problem is that they are in denial. And the more you push the truthful picture of what's really happening onto them, I actually think the more recalcitrantly they're going to be in denial. And there are things that could shift that. One of them is if there is more possibility to act upon one's conviction that the war is a disaster and that the regime is illegitimate. But at the moment, that avenue for action is so narrow, it's virtually zero. You're going to go to prison, and you're not going to achieve anything. That basically Russians are sitting poor. If there were possibilities for action, meaningful action, Russians would act more and they would take more risk. Now, if we were to categorize, I think, the whole population, very crudely, I invite people to break it down into 50, 25, and 25. The 50% are the folks who are fundamentally demobilized. They are not wanting to think about politics. They want to outsource politics to Putin. And that's interesting because that means they're not supporting the war. They're supporting Putin and whatever he does. If Putin had decided to not do the war, indeed, if he had decided to make further concessions to Ukraine on 24 Feb instead of invading, they'd have supported him probably in similar numbers. And then there are two other groups. Let's call them 25 and 25, although I suspect that the anti-regime and anti-war group is bigger than the vehemently pro-war, pro-mobilization group. But let's roughly call it 25 and 25. So there's 25% of the population that I think are feeling that the government is borderline at war with them. And that's an interesting thought, because it suggests that this isn't just a war between Russia and Ukraine, that it's a kind of complex conflict on the ex-Soviet space between a kind of authoritarian imperial model and something that's more like a democratic modern republic. And that's a thought the Russian political philosopher Greg Yudin often likes to emphasize. And I'm in huge sympathy with him on this. And then there is 15 to 25% who are now wanting more, who feel Putin is not going far enough, who actually probably feel he shouldn't have started the war. But now that he has, he's got to go further. That's quite an interesting party that's developed in Russia, I feel, over the last few months. The party that says we shouldn't have done it, but now that we have, Putin is being far too complacent conservative. So that's a kind of a cartoonish entry into where I sense the Russian population is at.
But it's that group who are embittered, angered, and actually distressed by the failure to achieve objectives. Perhaps they're the ones more likely to actually take action against Putin and depose him, but not necessarily replace him with somebody who's going to be any more amenable to the West. It could be someone who is, I won't use the word worse because that's judgmental in a way, but someone who is even perhaps more extreme, less of a pragmatist.
I think that we are a bit early at this point for talk about how Putin might be deposed, but it's not illegal to go there. And I think that one of the scenarios is a pessimistic scenario, that a kind of junta takes over, made up of the Siloviki. I think that at the moment, Putin has got this pro-mobilization, pro-escalation party just about under control, but it's borderline and the trend's going in the wrong direction for him. And that's creating a problem because Putin is committed to keeping most of the population politically passive. I mean, that's how the regime works. But he also knows that he may need to mobilize the population to some extent to continue with his project of this war and keep everybody on board. And that's a very thorny balance. And he doesn't know, I think, yet how he is going to balance it, because the whole regime is predicated on politics just being outsourced to the government and people just getting on with their private lives. But the war broke this, because the war is too much of a real event to leave what we often call a kind of hybrid authoritarian regime, an information autocracy, to leave it functioning as it previously was. And so the war created this tear because it's not the sort of project that regimes like this do. And one of the solutions to this tear might be to create a second tear, which is to mobilize some of the population. And that's vulnerable, unpredictable, and uncertain, because that's just not how a regime like that works. So it's really, really tricky for Putin now, because he is desperate to mobilize the population more, and he's desperate to keep them immobilized.
He probably understands his people very well as well. He knows that, yes, you can conscript, or you can have kontraktniki in the provinces, really poor areas where people aren't, earning or get a chance for a better life. So you can draw your soldiers from there, and many have come from the provinces. But once you start forcing, let's say, the more middle classes, educated classes in the large urban centers to send their sons to war in a non-voluntary basis, that breaks some kind of social or unwritten social contract, doesn't it?
I think that it's a radical existential shock for most Russians at the prospect of anything like a nearly full forced mobilization. They simply don't expect it. And I think that's true both for disadvantaged Russians who are rural or who are in small towns, as well as for the more privileged Russians in Moscow and Petersburg who are scrambling to get the latest illegal iPhone. So it'll be a big, big shock, which is why, especially with my political philosopher goggles, I'm tempted to say that you can't do military mobilization without doing political mobilization first. And I think Putin probably recognizes that. But he also knows that it might not be possible to do political mobilization. I mean, you can't just turn a state more fascist on a whim. It may not work. It needs quite a few moments of moment and collective forces to go your way. I think that's the trend, but the problem for Putin is that it's going in that direction very, very slowly. So Russia is becoming sort of infinitesimally more totalitarian every week. He needs more, but at the same time, he is aware that that might not be possible or possible yet. I suspect that what he's thinking is that events could occur that could operate as kind of levers to mobilize the society more. And that would mean various kinds of escalation in the Ukraine war. And that might include severe defeats followed by escalatory responses to these defeats and so on. So Putin is probably in a position where he doesn't have a solution at the moment to this dilemma he is in, and he's waiting to see if sort of the winds of history throw him something.
And he's in a corner. I mean, normally he would escalate his way out of a crisis, but every form of escalation that he has open to him will potentially open a Pandora's box. So this is perhaps a unique position for him. Over the last 22 years, I don't think he's faced a crisis like this one of his own making, it has to be said.
I think he's not faced a crisis like this, but I also think it's a much worse and more phobic Putin and more paranoid Putin that we've got now. He is probably showing us enough discipline and stability of decision making to not terrify us too much, that since the war he hasn't behaved too erratically, except for starting the war itself. But I don't think we have got the same Putin we had 10 years ago. This is a Putin who is less likely to perform well under extreme circumstances where he needs to make decisions. So unfortunately, it's not that we have to give up on the idea that he's a rational agent. I think all humans are rational agents, quite frankly. But I think that we may need to broaden our picture of what rational agency might look like. And I think that's one of the things the war has forced us into. And I think that one of the reasons that people watch conversations like this so passionately is because this war just doesn't make any sense to them. It doesn't make sense, even on Putin's own terms, as far as people can see, that he should start this war. What is going on? And then people begin to see that there are various kinds of mystical and civilizational reasons coming into play. And they begin to realize, well, there are people in the world who are going to potentially keep starting wars for reasons that are profoundly alien to us. And so that's one of the things that's, I think, quite difficult to learn, but we're trying to learn it, because as crazy as some of our politicians in the West are, none of them would quite start a war for reasons as obscure and as sort of historically delusory and self-aggrandizing as Putin did. Even with the ghastly sort of layers of lies and bullshit that led to Iraq, it was not anything as crazy as what Putin came up. And Putin has come up with an extraordinary sort of ill-assorted collection of facts that he's assembled into an historical narrative that no historian would accept. And he has continued sort of sellotaping elements to that narrative. And it's got features of the mystical, it's got features of, and he's got features of the occult even in the way he thinks. So this is very alien stuff to us. And I think that we have to keep on our toes as far as our picture of what it means for us to think of Putin as a rational agent goes, which is not comfortable.
No. I mean, it makes me think a little bit of the stories you hear from British history. I mean, it's not a great analogy, but many of the great families who have these grand houses, they have emblems, girb to add some kind of authenticity. You go back far enough in their history, and you'll find some murderous bandit who was able to kill a bunch of people and then be knighted and rewarded with lands, etc. And to an extent, there's a process going here. He started as an opportunist, but as he's got older and perhaps even realized his mortality, he's looking at his position in history. He's looking to create some sort of great feat. He's just chosen something and probably based it on incorrect information or biased information he's been given. Something he thought could seal his legacy, but actually it's going to do the exact opposite.
And what's extraordinary is that he is still committed to his project about how Ukraine shouldn't be a real country, even after all the evidence has sort of hit him right in the face. And that does seem quite extraordinary to us. And I think what makes it even more extraordinary is that these sort of long, sincere historical narratives coexist with the gangster criminality of the Putin regime. It's really like, your village thief is the priest.
Yes.
And that does seem particularly strange to us, that we've got this quasi-mafia organization that nevertheless has these missionary ideas to do with historical destiny and collective self-realization. And that's quite a lesson to us about why humans make war. And I think that it's a lesson, unfortunately, we're going to run into beyond Putin and beyond Russia in this century. As tempting as it is to think that, we're beyond this phase where wars are done for reasons that aren't about clear geopolitics, clear resource interests, clear economic concerns, and so on. So that's something that ain't gonna go away, these kinds of mystically motivated wars.
And if we put a label on him like he's a psychopath or whatever, that's an easy way to shut down analysis, isn't it? Shut down debate and just put him in that little crazy box and say, oh, we don't have to worry about that. That doesn't help us actually deal with what's going on here, because in his mind, there may well be rational processes, rational reasons why he believes that the struggle is still one that he can win and is worth fighting. And I think it comes back to something you've said over and over on your channel, is the idea of nihilism, that there is, in his mind, no such thing as democracy. There's no such thing as an organic revolution. There's no altruism. There's no truth. If he genuinely believes these, and I think he does, he won't be seeing Ukrainians' brave resistance as something that comes out of their statehood or out of their civil society. He will see it as an existential or proxy war between America and Russia, a fight for survival, and something that is orchestrated through, the technology of regime change.
I think he is probably sane enough to realize that Ukrainians desperately don't want him there.
Yes.
But I think he would say, give it 2 or 3 generations. This will be washed away. And he'll say the same about the number of Russian soldiers that have been killed. Is it 50,000? Could it be 500,000 a few years from now? That's fine for him. That's really fine, because history will absorb it all. The problem he's got, however, is that historically, empires that have had a measure of success, even if it's ghastly and ugly success, have at least offered something. And what's absolutely unique about this empire, and I think that does rather come out in the recent Dugin story that we've all been talking about, is that it's not clear what this empire is offering at all. Like, what is Putin's colonial project offering Ukrainians? And typically what you can say is that it's something you terribly much don't want, but at least this empire is offering you a couple of things that are interesting. But that's just not true in this case at all. So what is stunning is the nihilism of Putin's own project, insofar as it's offering violence and not much else. There is no vision of the future there for any of the ex-Soviet bloc countries, including for Russia, that really makes any sense. And that's why Dugin has titillated a lot of people in the West, because it seems like, well, here is somebody who may, after all, give us some kind of a rationalization of what is being offered, because we can't see what is being offered, to be honest. But maybe this man with a beard has somehow got some kind of story that makes sense if only we listen to him long enough. Plus, he looks enough like Rasputin, the sort of thing we'd expect the Russians to come up with. So that could be plausible. But of course, I maintain that there isn't any kind of philosophical song and dance you can come up with that will paint any kind of a story about this colonial project offering anything.
I mean, all it offers is the reproduction of its own methodology, almost like a transfer of DNA, which is criminality, nepotism, and a certain way of doing things. It's a process rather than some big concept.
And it's importantly also, I think, a challenge for us, because in not offering us much except this kind of messianic quasi-mafia situation, because it doesn't offer anything beyond that, the question for us arises, well, how do we deal with projects like that project when they come our way in a globalized world? And that means that the rejection of Putin's nihilistic project has to be more than just the rejection of Putin's nihilistic project. It has to be, at least aspirationally, the rejection of certain things that are very much part of how our globalized world works, how the international system works. And in that direction, a degree of revaluation is, I think, potentially in order, because this project that Putin has come up with has been, to a very good extent, normalized and legitimated by formal and informal political and economic processes and structures around the world.
And that I think is a great point, because he hasn't just exported propaganda, he hasn't just exported oligarch money or yachts or whatever. He has also been part of a system that has created a way of doing propaganda, a kind of polyphony, as it were, of narratives, throwing spaghetti at the wall. And you see, perhaps to a lesser extent, in the Brexit process, you see in the election of Trump, whether or not GRU or Russians were directly involved or not, you see a co-opting of the techniques that are being developed. and they're highly corrosive for our political processes, our institutions, our civil society, cohesion of culture. All these things seem to be coming apart at the seams.
I think as Peter Pomerantsev pointed out quite early on, there's this kind of remarkable postmodernist quality to not just Putin's Russia, but even the Russia of the 1990s was already heading there. And that's, I think, first of all, very different to Soviet manipulation of reality, Soviet propaganda, which tried to tell you a kind of pious story that was unbelievable, but it never challenged the idea that there were things that were true and there were things that were false, which the way the Putin regime talks about itself, I think, does challenge. And funnily enough, even in the ideas of Alexander Dugin, that postmodernism comes out too. And that's a real problem we've got to watch for, quite rightly, as you say, at home. We are terribly keen to call politicians in our countries liars when we feel they're lying a great deal. But in recent times, I feel that a lot of the politicians who have been called liars aren't actually liars. There's something else. They're people who give up on the idea that there should be a coherence of any kind between different things you say on different days. And that's quite a different proposition. In other words, that's a story that takes you in a direction of destabilizing a citizen's faith in anything being clearly true. That's different to persuading a citizen of a particular false account of something. Because, if I tell you that you're going to reach the river if you go right, but in fact, you've got to go left, that's not going to destabilize your sense of truth. But if I say that you've got to go left and right and left at the same time, and I keep on talking in that light, that might rather encourage you to destabilize your sense that anything might be true, that either nothing is true, or if something is true, it's not properly discoverable. And the trouble is, the more concerned citizens get that they don't know what's going on, the more determined they are not to get duped, the more likely they are, especially in this kind of environment, to give up on the very idea of truth itself. And that's a very paradoxical kind of process, because if I don't want to be duped, I'm deeply committed to the truth. I want to desperately avoid being complicit in getting things badly wrong. But when you add that aspiration into the particular social context in which we are currently stuck, it so often leads to citizens giving up on the idea that anything is true at all. And that is very corrosive, because what that makes you feel isn't that politicians are bad and institutions are bad, or that they're acting against your interests. It makes you feel that these institutions don't really make sense, that they're kind of unintelligible, that it's a kind of ill-assorted combination of different kinds of sports games all rolled into one. And I'm looking at something and I'm seeing table tennis bats, rugby balls, footballs.
No rules.
It's not clear what to do in that game. It's not clear that that game works. And if it's not clear that that game works, why not get rid of it, or at least throw snowballs or exit it and see what happens? And once you put it like that, the position of a Trump voter stops seeming as irrational as it might otherwise seem, because that's somebody who has given up on the idea of institutions making sense. And that's a helpful direction in which to go, because first of all, it takes us out of the story of painting fellow citizens as deplorables. But secondly, it creates a situation where we can empathize as opposed to ridicule people we're trying to coexist with and persuade. Because what's really interesting is that if you look at the sort of audience that I tend to talk to on YouTube, they are overwhelmingly not Trump voters. They are probably in large numbers centrist, center-left, or even more left than center-left. There's a few solid right-wing people there too. But they're tendentiously people who think about things, who read books, who read not just newspapers, but in many cases, the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books. But actually, they too feel that politics is no longer quite making sense, and they feel a bit lost. And I think admitting that is very important, because it means that we can't contrast some kind of lecturer in sociology at the London School of Economics with a Trump voter and say, well, they are completely unlike each other. Actually, both are feeling lost.
Yes.
And that's very, very significant. And we've got to always try to reach for ways that citizens are struggling to make sense of what's going on, that goes below or above the culture wars, and frame the problems we've got as much as possible, not in us versus them terms, even though, of course, that's inevitable. We're going to have us and them. But we've got to try as much as possible to go beyond that, to go deeper and see if there aren't pressures that are actually acting upon all citizens, to which they're then responding very differently, such that if you search deep enough, the sociology lecturer at LSE and the Trump voter are actually responding in very different ways to some shared cultural deformation that are freaking them out.
And there's another commonality, and I've been thinking about this a lot, because I get into quite a few arguments with colleagues, and I've been trying to analyze who those colleagues are. And what's interesting about it is the ones I have the most vehement arguments with are the ones who are also reading a lot. I don't argue with the ones who don't read much or who've disconnected from the TV news. You know, they want to meet friends, they want to go for a drink. They don't really want to talk about these topics. They perhaps don't spend much time thinking about them. If they do, they're not going to take any action. So we tend to argue with people who are actually a little like ourselves, in that they are active and they're thinking and they get quite obsessed with certain topics, but they've somehow often got themselves into an echo chamber, or they've been hooked by some weaponized concept. And from the outside, it just looks crazy, because their frames of reference are different from ours. But perhaps inside that bubble, there's a certain consistency. There's a simplification of reality that makes a lot of sense if you're inside that informational reference point.
One of the things that I'm very much observing about Western societies at the moment is that we're having a crisis of civic belonging. We're having a crisis of all of us feeling like citizens. And one of the reasons I talk as much as I do about the war and about Russia is manipulative, because Russia is an extreme example of this absence of a sense of shared civic belonging. And what's, I think, dangerous, particularly in the more progressive circles in the United States and in Britain and on the continent, but sometimes to a lesser degree, is the idea that we feel that we're all thinking really well about our country and our politics, and then these other fellow citizens are just being irrational, and that they've got to wise up, or they've got to break out of the influence of malign foreign agencies like Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine. And if only they snapped out of that, they'd realize how stupid they were to vote Trump or to vote for Brexit. And that's problematic.
Because they're not going to happen. They're not going to change necessarily, or not quickly.
And it's problematic because politics isn't an argument. You can't win in politics by being correct. You know, if you and I are together in a restaurant and we have a fight about what we're going to drink, it's not quite possible for one of us to be correct and the other incorrect, because we're sharing a space, we're negotiating a space together, and there isn't, as it were, an intellectual way of sort of asserting that what one of us wants is best and is true, because it's not just an intellectual disagreement. It's about a shared negotiation of a shared space. And that's what politics is. And people who we feel are irrational don't get to go away just because we feel they're irrational. They keep sitting at the table of politics with us. And we can't get rid of them unless we emigrate or secede. And so I think that's really, really important. And that's why I made a kind of a bizarre video a couple of months ago talking about responsibility as citizens for things we don't agree with. And I sort of said that all Russians are not to blame for the war at all, but are responsible for it. Just like I am, even though in the voting booth, what I do is clear. If you give me a choice about Remain or Brexit, I'm going to vote Remain every single time. But I am responsible for Brexit. I'm a British citizen. I've been a British citizen for a quarter of a century. And my fellow citizens marginally voted like that. I'm associated with that decision. I can't just say it's these idiots over there and just externalize it. No, I am part of what generated this outcome. And even though it wasn't my preferred choice, I lost. I take responsibility to some extent for that decision. And that's nothing magical, nothing heroic. It's just to say that I share a bond of citizen belonging with people who voted for something I really, really didn't want. And just because they voted and they won and I lost doesn't break that bond completely. And in fact, the best way of going forward is to recognize that bond. And we do feel that bond still to some extent, of course, in the West, but the trend is in the wrong direction. And that's why it's fascinating to look at countries that are struggling with having no democracy at all, like Russia, where there's a complete absence of this kind of bond. And in equal measure, it's fascinating to look at countries like Belarus, where there is that kind of bond, despite them being, as it were, taken hostage by their political regime. We can learn a very great deal from both of these countries, even though they're opposite kind of scenarios. One, a complete lack of a sense of citizenship, and the other, flourishing sense of citizenship, and a quite extraordinary flourishing of a sense of citizenship in Ukraine that Mr. Putin has created.
Absolutely. And combined with that, I mean, I've been talking to a lot of Ukrainians, and it's interesting, even in the Western media, you'll have military experts, you will occasionally have, oppositionists and so on. Not so many Ukrainian voices, even now, appearing on mainstream media. So I'm trying to talk to as many Ukrainians as I can. And the sense I get is not just a flourishing of culture, which is there and it's visible, but also an extraordinary flourishing of self-organization, the horizontal approach rather than the vertical approach to getting things done. And some people have said that actually, yes, that was evolving definitely before the war, but there's been an extraordinary explosion. Everybody has got either a job or a task to do, and they've got several things on the side they're doing, whether it's to help neighbors or communities or build projects on a greater scale using the skills they have. An extraordinary sort of almost like total social war that's taking place.
And I would go as far as saying that this second challenge for Ukraine, if and when Ukraine wins the war, whatever we might mean by that, is as interesting and as important as the challenge of winning the war in the first place. Ukraine has a very fragile and evolving sense of civic belonging, the idea that there's such a thing as being Ukrainian, and that's about pluralistic belonging to a kind of polity. It's also, I think, a very clear sense that in this tension going on the ex-Soviet bloc, that you've taken a very clear position. You're rejecting the authoritarian and colonial picture, and you're taking the side of something like the modern democratic republic. However, it's an enormous challenge for Ukraine, and it's not clear it will succeed. I wish it very much to succeed, but it's no more than a coin toss how this will turn out, because this kind of evolution is very difficult for a country to go through. It's going to have to go through that evolution at a time when its potential models are actually traveling in the wrong direction. So Ukraine is going to have to become a modern democratic republic at a time when modern democratic republics are experiencing democratic decline. So Ukraine is going to have to do some things differently to how Western countries are doing them if it is going to succeed civically. And there aren't easy solutions there. My solution is always to say, well, look, the richer their conversation is, the better. So we're seeing a few talking heads in Ukraine. There are people who are encouraging the country to talk to itself. And we need more of them. We need more of them, and we need different kinds of them. And we need to cheer Ukraine on as it deepens that kind of conversation with itself. It's still a country that's bad at talking to itself. And it's a country that talks to itself via too narrow a number of people. That needs to deepen, that needs to grow. And I, on the one hand, I'm absolutely thrilled about that being something that Ukraine takes on as a challenge after winning the war against this brutal colonial invasion that Putin has orchestrated. But at the same time, it's a big task, and it's a challenging task, and we're far too glib about it. We think that Ukraine's just going to travel. Well, we have a history of some ex-Soviet states not traveling too well at periods of transition, even though they got freedom and so on. So it's going to be very important for Ukraine to flourish in this way, and pretty much nobody can help it except it itself. It's just got to deepen its capacity to talk to itself, and hope that that leads to it becoming a modern democratic society that takes the best things from Western countries, but also does some things differently, does some things in a way that we can't do them at the moment very well in the West. And that's remarkable. Now, if it were to succeed, it could become a model for us.
Absolutely. It really recalls to mind two conversations I had in the last week. One with a Ukrainian journalist, and the other with somebody who understands or speaks to a lot of the Russian intelligentsia. And I think it's quite telling, both these points of view. The Ukrainian was saying, yes, we're very grateful for Western support, Western weapons, but we've got a long way to go to tackle corruption. We've got a long way to go to evolve our judiciary. Yes, some things have been fixed. Some things are much better than they were. The judiciary is one area which still has a lot of the Soviet hangovers, and we've got to tackle that. We've got to tackle the oligarch influence. And that person said, only we can do that. And that was quite interesting. The other conversation with someone who talks extensively to Russian oppositionists, and we were discussing the visa issue. And they said that, well, the one thing you need to understand about the opposition in Russia, many of them are now abroad. Those that aren't they want the route to be open so they can get a tourist visa, come to the West, and then potentially claim asylum. And real anger that there's this threat of closing that down. And this person said the anger is directed at the West, because we wanted the West to do more for us. We wanted the West to do more in 2012 at Bolotnaya to protect and help support our insurgency and so on. But to my mind, there's a really interesting thing, which is we want somebody to come in and do this thing for us. Whereas the Ukrainians are saying, only we can do this thing. Only we can make this happen if it's going to be an organic, sustainable process. I know these are just two individuals, but to me, it speaks to a wider sense that Ukraine is starting to take responsibility for its own fate. Whereas different classes in Russia still quite haven't reached that point that they need to take full ownership of their evolution as a political system.
I think that the extraordinary flourishing of kind of horizontal war mobilization, political mobilization, civic mobilization in Ukraine is remarkable and is culturally out of reach for Russia at the moment. I think that a lot of the Russian opposition leaders are doing a remarkable job, particularly those who have stayed. And I think that in some ways, a lot of those who have left are doing remarkable work in covering the war, exposing the crimes of the Putin regime. But I am not yet cumulatively impressed with what the Russian opposition are up to. Because if you ask the very basic question, what's your vision of Russia's future? The answer can't be Russia has to lose the war.
Yes.
That's just true. Well, that happens to be my view, at least, that Russia should emphatically lose the war. That's the story that goes against the sort of Noam Chomsky kind of proposal that we should be quicker rather than slower to negotiate. So yeah, I share that. I actually think Putin needs to maximally lose, but that's not a picture of where Russia needs to go.
Is it? It's
and so it also is obviously not compatible with the idea that you don't just get a kind of Western democracy, even if the Putin regime were to implode and crumble. You're going to get something, and you're going to have to work with that. And that requires an ongoing conversation. And at the moment, I would love the Russian opposition to spend more psychic resources, psychological resources on, if not directly engaging with Russian citizens, because they can be hard to talk to at the moment, but engaging with the story of where Russia needs to go. What kind of political system does Russia need? What forms of decentralization are going to have to be implemented? How far is Russia a European country? What should Russia's relationship with Europe be? What should Europe's relationship with Russia be? The Russian opposition needs to have a very clear position, it seems to me, on how Europe should A, think of itself, B, relate to Russia. And I'm not saying that position is absent, but I'm saying that it's kind of fleeting. And it needs to be absolutely put front and center. So we're missing at the moment from much of the Russian opposition what I would call politics. And we've got activism. We've got anti-war activism. And anti-war activism is great, but it is what it is. And moreover, somebody might say, Russia isn't going to comprehensively lose this war with a NATO parade in Red Square, unless we have a nuclear war, in which case that could happen. But I think that short of that, Russia is still going to be there. And one of the things we want is for this sort of story not to repeat itself. And that requires more than just, let's defeat Putin now, let's stop this war. It requires a picture of where that country is going and where it sits in terms of its civilizational, economic, political ties with the West and with Europe too. And I think that needs to be painted clearly. I would be very slow to level an accusation like this against Russian opposition leaders who are in Russia, because they are doing heroic things.
And many are in prison, so they have very little agency to affect
As
anything from
far as the major ones,
yes,
they're all in prison except one who's under house arrest.
yes.
But the ones who are in the Baltics or in Georgia or in Germany, I think they need to go there more. And so this is a complaint that I'm submitting.
Go to the people, like in the 19th century, to an extent.
I mean, it's not just them. I mean, we are doing this badly too. What is Europe? Is all of Europe Europe? Or is there some fundamental difference between Germany and France on the one hand and Poland and Latvia on the other? Europe is not doing a great job of having a conversation with itself about what it is. And whether there is one Europe, whether there are two Europes, and how also Europe sees Russia in the future. Do we see Russia as permanently stuck in this sort of recalcitrant, ghastly dynamic of colonial expansionism? Do we see Russia beyond that? And that's not just sort of daydreaming. It very much affects what we do. I mean, for instance, if we realize that the Putin project is a Russian project, but it's also a global kind of project that we have been complicit with, and it's a project we've got to stop. Well, going in that direction and saying, well, no, we see a Russia beyond this, gives us much more encouragement about maximally insisting on a Putin defeat than a scenario whereby we think that Putin is a kind of inevitable normality for that country. And since we can't defeat them, we're going to have to keep negotiating. So we need more clarity on all of these questions and a better conversation about all of them. And we need to frankly know whether, when polls say we feel that Putin is a security threat to us, not just an economic threat, whether we say that we are in solidarity with them and we're all Europeans, or do we say, well, Putin is a security threat to you, but to us in France and Germany is just an economic threat, and that's different. And there are these tiers in how we think of European political identity. So all of these questions we too have to do better with. So it's not just the Russian opposition who I feel could evolve.
And we should understand that from Britain's point of view, because we always have had this, are we European or are we something else? Do we sit with our former greatness, etc., as an empire? There is this similar kind of conflicts going on in Britain. But in Russia, they go very deep, don't they? Back to Peter the Great, where a European culture and civilization was grafted on to an isolated kingdom. That's not to say, I mean, Kiev and those borderlands were different, but Rus itself, Muscovy, had an identity imposed upon it. And ever since, there's been this tension, hasn't there, between the Westernizer component and the Slavophile. And to an extent, we're seeing some kind of confusion of identity at the heart of the current crisis as well.
I think that's really an important thought, but it's also worth adding that some of the most anti-Western thoughts that we encounter in the intellectual history of Russia, thoughts that have also had cultural currency beyond just the books of Herzen or Belinsky or whatever, they are thoughts that are totally driven by European resources. That's quite interesting. Even if you look at the barely coherent philosophical ravings of Alexander Dugin, they are almost entirely constituted of European thought.
And framed more for a European audience, because he didn't get as much traction perhaps in Russia as he got in alt-right circles in the West.
I think that's absolutely true and a very interesting point. But I think, just to finish the previous thought, when Russia tries to turn away from Europe, it can't do that coherently, in my view, beyond a certain point without using European resources but then address it right back at European civilization. So I think that there's a real impossibility about making that turn too far, because the further you go, you're just going to end up coming back full circle. But I think that the Dugin thought is interesting, just how much his own philosophy relies on various kinds of European resources, and how much it's also arguably true that his influence, as extraordinary as that might sound, is a little bit higher in the West than it is in Russia. And to some extent, his influence in Russia is about various kinds of politically radical folks trying to leverage the myth of Dugin in Europe and bring the currency of that back into Russia, which of course means that for all of the symbolic repercussions of the killing of Dugin's daughter, Daria, it never has been true that Dugin is Putin's brain. He isn't at all. And Putin has probably tried to read Dugin at some point, but I would be absolutely astonished if he did more than a couple of pages.
No, especially as you consider, the architect really of the Crimean War, and until a few years ago, one of Putin's actual brains, Surkov, who is a postmodern PR man, not the kind of ideologue or the nationalist ideologue that Dugin is. I think that postmodern, almost like we don't have a point of view, but we're going to try different things. We're going to project power and control and just see what works. That perhaps more is descriptive of Putin's methods.
I think somebody like Kovalchuk might be the chief sort of ideological influence on Putin recently. So Putin is able to buy into certain kind of strange spiritual and historical narratives, but they can't be too intellectually rich or sophisticated. And my bet is that what he privately reads is war fiction. That's my sense of what Putin's reading, rather than sort of proto-fascist, quasi-fascist Russian texts.
More entertaining, because there's a whole genre now, isn't there, of alternative reality, little war novels, imagining, the Russian Empire as it might have been under different historical circumstances. A fairly toxic subgenre. I wonder, I don't know if he reads that, but maybe that's the kind of stuff he reads.
He, I think, does quote Ivan Ilyin a bit, but again, that's sort of dipping in and out more than dipping into Dugin. But basically, once you get, I think, beyond a certain level of literary or reflective sophistication, Putin is just assembling quotes rather than meaningfully engaging with anything. So the idea that you would look for some kind of coherent intellectual project that's echoed in Putin's decisions, I think that probably is an illusion.
It's not there. And he has writing teams. He has teams of researchers. So whatever he says that sounds so erudite, I mean, he is very quick at thinking on his feet, isn't he? And he has got quite a verbal dexterity, but he also has a huge machinery of speech writers and people who go through multiple layers of editing and iteration to get to eventually what you see on TV. I mean, I remember speaking to actually someone who was part of that writing team, and I'm amazed at the cost and the engineering that goes into that public persona that you see.
I think what is interesting, though, is that you can often detect Putin's allergies and phobias coming out very clearly. And you can clearly say that is definitely him and not somebody who's contributed to the speech writing. And I think that Putin's desperation to write Lenin out of Russian history, largely because Lenin is a revolutionary, and that is the worst of all things, partly because you can't coherently be a revolutionary on Putin's terms without being a foreign agent as well. And for that reason, he tries to link together the Russian Empire with the Soviet project by making his sticky tape go over Lenin and obscure Lenin's role. And I think that one of the fundamental things that I like to emphasize is that there are very significant discontinuities between the Soviet project and the Russian Empire. And that can be really an important point to make, because if you're a small country on Russia's border and you have justified long-standing historical trauma from the Russian Empire and all of its incarnations, whether it's the Soviet incarnation or the previous incarnation, you mightn't be very interested in the difference. Well, there they go again. I mean, it's centuries old and stuff. But I actually do think that in terms of understanding the extraordinary dislocation and trauma you find in Russian society, you have to center the Soviet experiment. In other words, the trajectory in the 1910s is completely different. The trajectory in the 1910s is very optimistic and very free. And if you listen to, let us say, the voice of Kerensky, for example, who has recordings that are available from the 50s and 60s, because he lived out the rest of his life in France, what you hear is a kind of a free Russian, a Russian who is free of a special kind of weight that it's increasingly difficult to be free from after the Soviet project. And it's a special kind of trauma because the Russians can't say, well, they did it to us. Ukrainians can say, well, Moscow did this. Russians did it. The Russians did it themselves. They were the center of it. And I do think that it's important to center the Soviet project as itself a cause of some extraordinarily catastrophic things that impact Russian society that would not have been there had very contingent events gone differently in the 1910s.
And I'm old enough to have met people who were the children of emigres in the revolution. Some even, I did meet a very elderly gentleman who himself had emigrated. That was obviously a long time ago. And yes, they lived their lives out in the West, but you get a sense of a completely different Russia, a completely different sort of culture. And yes, they would have come from a fairly elite, well-off society, but it's people that I never actually met when I traveled from one end of Russia to the other. These kind of emigre characters created the impression of a Russia that could have been, I think, very, very different. And as you say, the novels of the Silver Age, the poetry, the culture that was going on from really the early 1900s all the way through to the revolution hint at a completely different trajectory that Russian society could have taken.
It's an extraordinary kind of historical experiment that Russia went through. And I mean, for somebody who knows nothing about it, just imagine your country suddenly being taken over by Al-Qaeda or ISIS for 70 years.
Yeah.
On and off with a few breaks, a few softenings on the accelerator pedal. That's going to screw you up really, really, really badly. And you can't underestimate just how unbelievably toxic that experiment was. And in my view, Russians born in this century are still inheriting the screwed upness and trauma of that experiment. They're freer, and hopefully that's going to make the consignment of Putin's project to the past easier, but they are still impacted. It's a society that still has not recovered from this. And we're going to have to watch how long it goes. But the degree to which this absolutely remarkable, catastrophic experiment has damaged the population is I think it can't be underestimated. And I think it is in sharp contrast to the Tsarist regime, you could sort of be tempted to say, well, look, we've got the liberation of the serfs only happening as late as the 1860s. We have got repression, secret police, all of that stuff. Yes, but for me, if we had a longer conversation about this, the argument I would make would be an argument of discontinuity rather than continuity between the different levels and different kinds, different qualities of ghastliness, very different order and texture of ghastliness that followed the 17th revolution. I think I distinguish it quite sharply from what came before.
I mean, one fact that I saw recently in a book was that Lenin signed more execution orders in a 4-month period, I believe, during the Civil War, than had been signed in the entire Romanov dynasty of 300 years or something. Now, I don't know if that's, that would need to be corroborated, but those who compare Tsarist repression to Soviet repression, it's a very different thing, isn't it?
It's a different thing. What we've learned since the end of the Soviet Union is how ghastly Lenin was and would have been had he lived longer. He enjoyed having people killed in cruel ways. We've got to be frank about that. He was a very able political operator, a very able political theorist, but also a gangster. And we have learned that it's not just Stalin, which is why it was so quaint, and in the end, I think forgivable, that Gorbachev never disabused himself of his fancy for Lenin. He always sort of abstracted Lenin out onto a kind of plane that had very little to do with his actual biography in the end.
Yeah.
But truthfully, historically, we have to say that Lenin was a very, very unlovely character. Stalin was worse, but the damage of that regime, I mean, if we talked about it separately, I'd probably go into a dive of making different points. I just don't want to. I'm just insisting on this kind of just tendentious observation, but it's unbelievable. I mean, I personally feel that and I've basically stopped going to Russia recently in the last few years, but when I encounter road rage in Russia, particularly when it escalates to people coming out of the car and beginning to quarrel or punch each other up, I palpably sense that damage that the Soviet system did. I feel it in the way people are interacting with one another, even in such a banal everyday situation as that. And I don't think that thing that I'm sensing would quite be there if we skipped the extraordinary turn of events in 1917, which is such a remarkable contingency. It's like a sort of little extremist dot among all of the reformist and revolutionary movements, and it's so bizarre that dot in the end came out dominant. There were so many other possibilities about where things could have gone, and it's only the very special history that occurred and the appalling policies of the Tsars, which radicalized the opposition further and further, that led us where we ended up. But it didn't have to. It didn't have to happen. But my word, it screwed that country up. And what we've then seen is that the other ex-Soviet states have tended to do so much better than Russia moving forward from this. Russia has, in my opinion, not just made no progress in recovering from the trauma of the Soviet regime, but it's gone backwards. It's made it worse.
The success of the 90s, well, success of the 90s, no one thinks about them as being successful. But when I was in Russia in the 90s, it was a much freer place. There was terrible chaos and hardship. And the cemeteries, because I walked through the old cemeteries, were full of young, fresh graves of people who had, been taken out by their business partners. So there was a lot of horrific stuff going on. But also, you weren't being told what to think. You weren't being told what to do. You had to go and make your own way. And there was a certain liberating sense of that. Of course, all of this has been erased. So where do we go from here? I'm going to quickly give my theory. I don't think it's hugely popular. My sense is that a top-down solution is not going to work. There is no solution that can be administered or legislated for, even with a liberal government. The only way is bottom-up reform, and that, to an extent, suggests breaking the country up into smaller packets, whether they form part of a federation or not, but creating much more locally accountable politics.
I think that's probably a conversation in of itself for another time. But my view is that some move toward decentralization is a prerequisite for Russia giving up its expansionist imperialist project. In other words, the structure as it is with this level of centralization, even if you made the centralization more transparent, more institutionally adequate than it, because at the moment it's informal. It's not just vertical. It's fluid and untransparent. But I do think that a significant measure of decentralization is a prerequisite of us seeing this imperialist project killed. Without it, I don't think it will go away, no matter what happens after Putin goes.
And conscious decentralization is going to be a much less bloody affair than accidental decentralization or fragmentation.
Absolutely, but we have to watch for this risk, because what Mr. Putin is going to have to realize is once you begin shifting borders like he's shifting, that's going to get other borders to start wobbling. Borders he didn't want to see wobble. So we're going to have to see where that story goes, and that isn't necessarily an optimistic. Narrative that seems to be looming there.
I think we've touched on so many themes that could probably spawn a dozen other conversations, and I really hope that we get the chance to talk again in the future. But this has been absolutely fascinating.
We will. My great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I really wholeheartedly wish luck and health and evolution to your wonderful conversation project on this platform and on other platforms.